Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This event is hosted by the RCMB Early Career Professionals Working Group. Today, our event is titled Rigor and Feasibility, part of a four-part series that we've run on building the Grant Writer's Toolkit. The format for today's session is a presentation by our panelists, followed by a discussion. And I will serve as one of the moderators. My name is Aparna Sundaram, and I'm a faculty member at the University of California at San Francisco. I'm going to popcorn over to Joe.
Hey everybody, welcome. I'm Joe Bednash. I'm an assistant professor at the Ohio State University. The purpose of our grant writing toolkit series is to provide early career professionals who are transitioning to writing independent grants with the perspective and advice of established investigators who have previously successfully navigated this path. We strive to have diverse panelists that showcase general strategies, tips, and pitfalls in an easily accessible forum. And just so everybody knows, the session will be recorded for posterity's sake today, and I'll toss it over to Scott.
Thank you, Joe. My name is Scott Denstaedt. I'm also an assistant professor here at the University of Michigan. I'm just going to give a shout out to Tiana Lino, who's been our ATS manager and helping organize all of these sessions. This is our session number 4 in the Grant Writers Toolkit for this year. And I think everything has gone really well. I will be monitoring the chat. So if you do have questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat at any time. We're going to try and focus all of our questions to the end of the session, but I will go through any questions that are added. If you could please and are able to, feel free to put on your video. That would be helpful for us to see you. And then do make sure that you're otherwise muted. Thank you.
All right, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists for today's session, Drs. Thomas Mariani, Darrell Kotton, and Louise Hecker. Dr. Mariani is a professor of pediatrics and neonatology and the vice chair for research in pediatrics at the University of Rochester. His research program focuses on identifying mechanisms of susceptibility to respiratory diseases, and he's served on numerous study sections at the NIH. Dr. Kotton is a professor in the Department of Medicine and the Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine at Boston University. He's also the founding director of the Center for Regenerative Medicine at Boston University and Boston Medical Center. His research program is focused on understanding the basic biology of lung repair and lung injury. And Dr. Hecker is an associate professor in the Department of Medicine at Emory University. Her research program is focused on regenerative biology and investigating mechanisms of tissue injury and repair, as well as the development of drug discovery platforms. Thank you all for joining us today.
So we'll begin the session with an overview of how to think about rigor and feasibility. That'll be delivered by Dr. Mariani. We'll then follow with some more specific suggestions as applied to the approach and team building by Dr. Kotton. And then finally, Dr. Hecker will share some advice around resources, budget, and budget justification. After that, we'll open the session up to questions and answers, questions from the audience and answers by our panelists. So we'll hand it over to Dr. Mariani.
Thank you so much. Hopefully you can hear me all right. If somebody could give me a thumbs up to make sure. Thank you very much. So next slide, please. So I really only have 2 slides today, so I doubt I'll take the allotted 10 minutes. So I hope you've come prepared with your questions. My first slide is a teaching slide. My second slide is not, and I'll get to that in a moment. So what I can teach you about rigor and feasibility when it comes to grant review is that I've experienced considering rigor and feasibility in 3 ways. So the first way that I've been trained to consider rigor and feasibility is evaluating the rigor of prior research. This is sometimes referred to as the scientific premise for a proposed project. And when it comes to considering rigor of prior research, within the confines of the current scoring system, this will impact the scoring of both your significance and innovation components. And some of the key questions in terms of how reviewers might consider the rigor of prior research is to ask whether the existing literature and the existing publications uh, have uh, 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 have made observations at a rigorous enough level to support an outstanding level of significance for the problem that you're addressing in your proposal. Another key question to evaluating rigor of prior research is that the question of whether or not the existing literature is rigorous enough to demonstrate that your proposal, and more specifically, your hypothesis, is conceptually innovative. A second way that I've been trained to consider rigor and feasibility from the perspective of a grant reviewer is considering rigor of the proposed experimental design. And again, in the confines of the current scoring system, this has the potential to impact the scoring of both the approach score and the innovation score. And the key question here is, has the applicant proposed a rigorous experimental design? Ways to frame this question would be, has she or he proposed appropriate methodology? And the appropriate methodologies should be complementary. There should not be an individual singular way to test a specified question, but there should be complementary approaches. And of equal importance, contemporary methodologies should be employed wherever possible. To get the highest level of enthusiasm on a grant review, you should not be proposing most of your methods that do not provide any level of innovation. A second way to consider rigor of experimental design, another key question, is, has she or he, the applicant, considered all of the critical variables in terms of the question and in terms of the way the data will be gathered? An easy way to address this question is, have you considered sex as a biological variable? But there are many other ways to consider this. One way you might that's easy to appreciate is, are you providing an examination of a dose response for an intervention? But there are many other examples of how one might build rigor into an experimental design. The third way I've been trained to consider rigor and feasibility in the context of reviewing a grant is simply feasibility of the experimental design. And in the context of the current scoring system, this really impacts your approach score. And there really is a very simple branching structure to addressing feasibility. You have either done this before, and you can cite your own prior work and, or at a minimum, include preliminary data that demonstrates your ability to apply the proposed methods. And if you haven't done this before, you really need to enlist someone who has appropriate expertise. And one might consider in that selection process the expert's recognition in the field, the proximity of the expert to the applicant, right? If it's somebody at your institution, everything else being equal, that's a better choice. If it's somebody next door to you, all things being equal, that might be a better choice. There are also considerations about whether or not it's important to use an expert in the field who may be recognized for her or his independent contributions, or sometimes it's equivalent or better if you use a service, and many of our institutions have core methods, or I'm sorry, service methods cores that we can utilize that can provide a demonstration of feasibility for specific experimental approaches. Next slide. So I was able to teach you about my experience in the past slide, but this slide I think is very important, but I can't necessarily teach you about what I need to provide information to you about in this slide. And that is, for as long as I can remember, although that probably is only about 10 to 15 years, we've been using the same scoring system at the NIH for independent research projects that uses 5 categorical scores that are graded 1 through 9, with 1 being the most outstanding and 9 being the least outstanding. The categories for those scores include significance, innovation, the investigator, the experimental approach, and the research environment. And then these are somehow combined to define an overall impact score. The overall impact score is almost always defined by the individual categorical scores. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, if every categorical score is a 1, it is almost impossible for the overall impact score not to be a 1. So that's what I mean, that the overall impact score is largely defined by the categorical scores. Now, the news is that starting with applications submitted January 25th of 2025, the NIH has decided to move to a quote-unquote simplified review framework for evaluating project applications. So for most intents and purposes, this means R01s. And the way the new scoring system is going to work, at least on paper, is there will now be 2 categorical scores. One that relates to importance of the research. This new categorical score is supposed to essentially combine the categories of significance and innovation, and will be graded on the same 1 through 9 scoring system. The second categorical score is now, as you might notice, something very relevant for our discussion today, rigor and feasibility. Now, according to the NIH, rigor and feasibility is supposed to relate to the prior categorical score of approach alone. Now, if you're paying attention, I just told you that rigor and feasibility can impact more than the current approach. It can impact significance, it can impact innovation, and can impact approach. Rigor and feasibility is intended to be scored along that same 1 to 9 scale. There will be a third category to grade applications, and this will be defined as expertise and resources. This will not be a continuous score or continuous variable score. This will be scored simply as acceptable or unacceptable. Unfortunately, I cannot teach you about how rigor and feasibility will be applied in the future on applications submitted after January 25th of 2025. But neither can anyone else, because no one actually has experience doing that as of yet. So I think it is important to keep in mind, and it could be an important framework for follow-up questions and answers. So with that introduction, I'm happy to turn it over to my co-presenters.
Hi, I'm Darrell Kotton. I'm going to pick up where Dr. Mariani left off and talk more about rigor and feasibility, focusing especially on lessons I've learned the hard way, perhaps through mistakes I've made, tell you some stories that help consolidate our learning in this session, and maybe prime some of your questions for discussion. And of course, when we're talking about rigor and feasibility here, we're especially focused on what used to be called approach, as Dr. Mariani introduced. So next slide. When I think about the study section, I'm thinking about the non-score driving criteria Dr. Mariani just covered, and Dr. Hecker following me will get more into details of the budget justification, and the resources, environment, and letters of support and feasibility. The score driving, or what used to be called approach, now it referred to as rigor and feasibility, is what I'm going to spend the bulk of my time talking about. But as Dr. Mariani was emphasizing, everything can overlap and impact the scores for across multiple categories. So how do you start to think about these three new categories, or the old approach category? I think approach is paramount. Thinking about actually the methods being used in the three aims is absolutely critical, and you cannot get a funded grant unless this approach section is excellent. So no matter how scholarly your review, as I've learned the hard way, and exceptional the other sections are, you just will not get funded if the approach isn't excellent. Now, if the scholarly review isn't excellent and your approach is excellent, could you get funded? I think yes. I think this is really important to keep in mind, that this is key. And we're going to go through some comment about the rigor and the methods, including these bullet points I've listed here: statistics, preliminary data figures. This is really showing feasibility in a visual form. People like visual forms when they're tired and reading your grants in their spare time. And I think Dr. Mariani already touched on sex as a biological variable, which we'll come back to here, and reproducibility. Reproducibility, what does that mean? It's a vague word. Reproducibility comes up at lab meetings. In grants, reproducibility is when a grant reviewer is thinking about, did the person talk about reproducing things across multiple cell lines or multiple mice of different sexes? What are the repeats? And so I think many young grant writers, we're talking about the K to R crowd here, take for granted that, of course, at our level, when we're writing a grant, people know we're not going to just sample one well, it's going to be repeated. But no, people do not give you credit for this. They might when you're very senior, but in the beginning, especially, tired grant reviewers are, getting irritated when people don't spell out, we'll do N equals what. So spell it out. That's what reproducibility means. And don't assume that they give you credit for having made it this far, that you'll obviously do more than one well. No, just spell it out for them. So let's dive into these tips and tricks on the next slide. All right. So the first, before we get into the bullet points, I just want to communicate to you that psychology of a study section. And this is really critical when you're writing your grant, okay? This is different. If you're doing a doctoral thesis, PhD, or prepping for your lab meeting, maybe the psychology is less important. You're just trying to do the best possible science you can. But that's not the case in a study section. What I mean is, keep in mind, ChatGPT is not grading your grants, not yet anyway. It is not a robot reading grant. It's a human being. This human being is not paid to be a full-time grant reviewer. They're doing this in their extra time, late at night. Maybe they put, the kids to bed, or they'd much rather prefer to be watching Netflix with their partner than reading your grant, perhaps at the end of a very long day. So that means if you fill up every single bit of white space all the way out to the margins in the smallest font you can, and your figures are shrunken to a little speck, yeah, ChatGPT might have given you credit for that, but a human being who's tired will not. So keep in mind the psychology. What I'm saying is, if you remember nothing else from my session, please remember that the secret to good grant writing is just as you write, put on your grant reviewer's hat. Pretend you're the grant reviewer. Put on that cap. Get in the mindset. Think of that person late at night in their spare time reading your grant, and you will instantly become a better grant writer. So this is the psychology. Let's dive into the first bullet point then. Your approach. Are you actually describing the method in terms of rigorous interpretation of results? You can't just assume the person knows after you've done the method that you'll be able to interpret the results. Give a little hint of a sentence of how you will interpret the results. When you're setting it up and there's N of 6 mice, okay, you checked a box for reproducibility. There's more than one mouse, you spelled it out, but is that a guess? Most people are guessing at that. The study section, especially for junior people, want to know that it's a thoughtful sample size. You have a sentence that your mentors can share with you the sentence that tells you about a power calculation. This is jargon. This is an 80% power to detect a difference of X, assuming a variance of Y. And so that simple sentence said early as you state sample size will get you very far. You don't have to keep saying that every time you have a sample size, but if you say it early up front, the human being on the other end thinks, thoughtful, careful scientist, not just making up sample sizes. Did you say how you'll interpret the results along with your pitfalls and alternative approaches? This is like checklists I've formed from the mistakes I've made. So pitfalls and alternative approaches. Every reviewer wants to see that. The easiest way is just put it as a little section at the end of each aim and put it in as a header while you're writing, while you're making your outline, so you don't forget, because you're going to be rushed at the end, and this is the easiest thing to forget. Can you clump all the alternate approach in at the very end of the grant? No, you cannot. The tired reader may not get that far before they get irritated with you. This person doesn't think of alternatives. Well, you did, but it was buried at the end. Just do it after every aim. Okay, so when you get to how you'll interpret the results, this is very important. A reviewer, the person who's tired on the other end, will respond to a story. A story means, just a human being reading something that's entertaining, that's interesting. You've given the scholar the review, the rationale. Hopefully they're engaged from page 1 and they're getting through your approach. Now, if your approach is, this is a mistake I've made, just a bunch of methods, paragraphs, this is how you're going to section the mouse, and this is how you're going to analyze the lung. It's just so incredibly boring to read. You will lose, no matter how rigorous it is, you'll lose a review and you won't get a good score, because boring grants tend to elicit a boring score. So how do you behave when you mentor someone? You talk about the method part and parcel of the result, and the expected result, especially the interpretation, shows something interesting, a story, what you're expecting to get and what you'll do about it. And if you don't get it, then the alternative approach, that becomes a story. So try not to do the grad student level. These are all my methods. Then here are some results, and assume the person knows expected results. Tell the story. Did you support feasibility? This is our third bullet point now. Feasibility means the person needs to believe that you can do the work. What is that? And you're junior, you're writing your first R1. How are they going to believe it? Well, letters of support are key. They may not be score driving, but they affect the psychology of some reviewer thinking you actually can pull this off. Ensure that the resources and environment pages are complete. Even if those aren't score driving, if you're doing a whole single cell RNA sequencing grant and you forgot in your templated boilerplate resources forms to include that there's a single cell core, a 10x Chromium machine on campus, well, forget it. The reviewers can easily just say, I don't think this is feasible. The person doesn't even have a single cell core. Well, of course you have a core, so list it. Did you forget to include sex as a biological variable? So Dr. Mariani brought this up, but you need to make this part of your checklist, because this is just the easiest way to get all your hard work dismissed, which would be sad because you forgot to explain that you're examining male and female mice both. Reproducibility, we talked about. State that you're going to repeat this. Replicates, number of mice. If you have one cell, if you're using an IPS cell, you try a second genetic background, basic things. Next bullet point. Okay, did you ask for templates and help? What do I mean by this? This is new to you. This is the most difficult, when you're writing your first R, the most difficult grant R you'll ever write. It's the first time. It becomes much more, once you've done it, it's, see one, two, and teach one. You can, just gets easier and you can teach others. But that first time through, everything is new. So please keep in mind, this is not new to your mentors. Your mentors have done this. Your institution has done this. Why recreate the wheel? You do need to write your own approach. Do you need to do everything yourself? Do you need to write the resources, the environment, the budget template? No, of course not. Ask for help from your mentors on the templates. Okay. Now, as I've made mistakes, I mean, you're so obsessed with getting your research section done, it takes you much longer than you think. And then working on that, I've left the easy stuff, resources, environment, etc., letters of support, till the very end and run out of time. This is a very common mistake beginners make. Please reverse the thinking. Get this part done first. You feel like you're wasting time. Oh my God, I'm making a budget justification and a letter of support I'm trying to get, and the resources up front, I'm wasting time. I should be doing the science. No, it's not a waste of time. It's freeing up your mind, your RAM, your bandwidth for the hard work that comes as you approach the deadline, which needs to be focused on finishing up the science. So get that out of the way first so you can think and ask for the templates from your mentors, from your administrator. You've never done a budget justification. Ask from the administrator. Meet with them. Meet with your administrator. Ask for an in-person or a Zoom meeting. Meet with your supervisor multiple times. Today, the trend is, email, text. Be different. Be the one, be old school. Be the one who asks for an in-person meeting. or at minimum a Zoom meeting, but no texts and emails for the really important stuff. What you will learn from these people, including your supervisor who you meet with multiple times, is so valuable. The stories they tell, the coaching they can give you about certain sections that bother them that you just can't get by email. So meet in person, and meet early, meet often with your supervisor. Respect your supervisor. A grant arrives on your supervisor's desk 24 hours before deadline is just a missed opportunity and not to your advantage. Send it early. What should you send early? You haven't done the grant. You don't have time. You don't have to send a whole grant. Many weeks or months before, you should be sending that first page with the specific aims. Why? Because if that page is not good, you will not get funded, no matter how spectacular the remaining pages are. Most grant reviewers have a feeling of whether they're liking your grant and going to fund it or not by the end of page 1. Now, they can feel great at the end of page 1, they're going to fund you, and then you can blow it afterwards. But nobody ever recovered from a horrible feeling at the end of page 1. If the reviewer thinks they're not going to fund it, this is silly or not important or not going to be rigorous, you will not recover in the subsequent pages. So that means that page 1 should be sent to your supervisor or colleagues or peers months and months ahead of time. And you might be surprised at the reactions, like aim 3 is fatally flawed. And then that's a major save months ahead of time. And then you go back with the page 1 rewritten for 2 times, 3 times, as many times as it takes till the page 1 is excellent, outstanding. And then you can write the rest. So if you do all that lump sum, 12-pager, the 48 hours before, there's very little hope for you. You're going to have to get extremely lucky in order to get funded. Get page 1 to your administrator, your supervisor months ahead of time. Next bullet point, there's a second to last now. Did you give the impression that you are sloppy? What do I mean? Of course you're not sloppy. You're just, you got too much work to do. It's very hard to write the first grant. So all the basic stuff out of the way, the templates up front, then you're writing your grant. All those months and months of hard work, you will blow in the last 24 hours, as I've done many times, as follows. Spell check, use the Microsoft Word tools, and you will catch all these typos. Now, you're so busy, you miss that step, you will hurt yourself. You will not get funded. Why? Because all those typos just telegraph to the reviewer that you're sloppy. A sloppy writer equals a sloppy scientist in the reviewer's mind. It doesn't mean you're sloppy. It means the reviewer who doesn't know you assumes you're sloppy, and that's really not good. So do the easy stuff. Don't leave out, please, the software spell checker. If English is not a native language for you, then you can use ChatGPT. Is I don't know the the rules of proprietary information going to ChatGPT, but something like that, AIs that get you that can suggest rewrites can be really helpful these days. ChatGPT is new emerging technology. We're discussing how to deal with it, but for sure that it's coming, and it should be a part and parcel of helping us be better writers. By the way, I have tried to, as many of you, I'm sure, have tried to have ChatGPT write a specific aims page for you. It's kind of a fun thing. You give it some prompts. It writes really vanilla flavored, generic specific aims pages that are impressive, and it's kind of pretty good, but it won't get funded. So I don't think I would recommend that yet, but help them clean up some of your English if you're not confident with certain paragraphs. Last bullet point, did you use your precious space? The time, page limit is very limiting, but did you use it effectively? Or did you give these overly detailed, very boring methods paragraphs without the story? Don't forget the human narrative, story about the results and expected results. That's very interesting. Methods tend to be boring. You have to write them. You have to write the power calculation, but don't make it ad nauseum. Where possible, use preliminary data figures. This is just basic tricks or past publications to save space. What do I mean by that? So the tendency, especially when you're beginning, even if you have a publication that uses single-cell RNA sequencing, or you have a figure that's already there with the whole flow of the beautiful cartoon into a UMAP right there on the page, you will tend to over-explain that UMAP and the method. You don't have to do that if you have a figure or sitting right there. You can say it will. I've given you a quote here. Single-cell RNA sequencing will be analyzed initially by UMAP visualization and Louise clustering. exactly as shown in figure 3. So that little phrase, just copy paste it from my page here. If you take a screenshot, that little phrase, as shown in figure 3, that's worth a paragraph of detail right there as a visual. Remember, the tired reviewer wants to watch Netflix will be very happy to see that phrase and not have to wade through a dense paragraph of all the alignment and jargon of the UMAP preparation. Just use the figure. It's right there. Now, if you don't have a figure, you better explain what you're going to do. But this is in the case of having a figure. All right. You guys are scientists, physician scientists. You know how to use PubMed. You know how to look things up. Grants are the same. You can look stuff up. You can do a PubMed search. So the next slide has a good hit. You know, how do you know the quality? Next slide. This is the quality. This is a good hit. This is a worthwhile read. So you don't have to just use PubMed to do your science. You can use PubMed to ask how to write a grant. And this paper in PNAS is a wonderful paper filled with tips that I like. And I put one of my favorites here, which just really emphasizes the story, the human story. Quote, crawl with aim 1 and set the stage. Walk with aim 2 to establish the crescendo, like a symphony. And finally, run with aim 3 and transform the science. What does this mean? This is a little highlight from the paper that's just telling you the approach is where it's at, and use those 3 aims. And that 3 aims aren't random. You don't slap it on the page. The order to those aims matters. And this is all about page 1. Again, you can send to your supervisor, but the sense should be aim 1 starts slowly. It's going to tend to take the most length of text. The most time you're developing your methods, you need to explain that power calculation in aim 1, because that's where you're setting the tone. I'm a careful scientist. I've thought this through. I'm crawling along, trying to set, the stage. If you're doing your CRISPR screen or something, and you're supposed to have that done already. But if you have to, if it's not done and you have to do something discovery-based, aim 1 is where you set things up and start to crawl, start to develop your model, define the transcriptome, validate something or test the hypothesis that just slowly developing. All right, aim 2, we're picking up now. We're walking along. It's starting to crescendo. It's getting exciting. The mechanistic testing, the aim tends to be shorter than aim 1. You don't have to regurgitate all the power calculations in the way you do know how to do a UMAP, and that's kind of, you've got some room to walk now. Run, aim 3. You can get a little bit of risky. Often people are trying to do a translational aim or apply a mouse model system to validation in human tissue in aim 3. Or maybe they've gone from mechanism in 1 and 2 to a treatment, a drug treatment in aim 3. So this is where you're really running, you're transforming the science, you're getting to why it's so important and impactful and innovative. Aim 3 can be exciting. It tends to be the shortest aim in length, tends to be the most risky of the 3, and that's just if you want to learn more, read more, there's the article for you. And I can't just to reiterate one last time, everything I've just said is about the page 1 aim. Get that page 1 to your supervisor, get comments back, and remember it's a common complaint of all beginners that say, well, I got all these 1s for the investigator and all my beautiful stuff, 1, 1, 1, but the approach was a 4 or a 7, and so I didn't get funded. No, ignore those 1s. It is in the end all about the approach, and even more so, it's about the page 1, which sets the approach. Page 1, get it to your supervisor. Good luck. Enjoy grant writing. It's not that hard. It can kind of be fun. It's just the hardest the first time out. Do 1, see 1, teach 1, and I'll see you at the meetings to see your beautiful funded work being presented. Good luck.
I think we're going to have Dr. Hecker share her screen.
Let's see, can you see this in presenter mode? Okay. Sorry, I'm just getting over a terrible cold, so my voice still isn't back to normal, but so I'm going to talk about the budget justification today. It's funny because earlier this morning I happened to mention to someone that I'm giving this talk at today, and I'm going to be talking about the budget justification, and that person said, "Yeah, that's cool, but it's not really that important, is it? Because it's not a score driving factor." And while technically, budget, is not a score driving factor, they're going to give their critiques and then discuss your budget. I think I could not disagree more. I think the budget justification is so important and can showcase so many different aspects of your research and including many of the score driving factors. I'm going to show you how, or at least how I do it. So I guess my first disclaimer is that, these are my personal tips and tricks. This is what I use. I'm pretty rigid about how I do my budget justifications and sort of in general, my kind of grant format. And they're not rules by any means. They're things that came from, my ability to successfully get grants. And so I see what works, but also having sat on nearly 30 study sections, I've heard a lot of the same comments over and over again. And that's really what led to what I'm going to show you today. First thing I wanted to just briefly touch on, just modular versus non-modular budget. I guess the easiest way, put simply, is a modular budget is fixed $250,000 or less in direct costs. Really, in my personal view, and maybe others may disagree, I mean, the only major difference is that it's a fixed budget and that you don't need to list specific dollar amounts. In my opinion, though, you really want to treat this, whether it's a modular or non-modular budget. Personally, I would say treat them the same in terms of what the level of detail they give. I saw this, I happened to see this, sorry, is this coming out blurry? It's coming out blurry in mine. I happened to kind of search this on, found this on the NIH website. This is from the NCI Institute, but they were going through what's better, modular versus non-modular. And this was a quote that I lifted, which I thought was perfectly appropriate, which is basically, it's the budget that you need to do the project. And I think that's a really important point. Like, you can't just go in and say, well, I'm going to do modular or non-modular. You really have to go through this exercise of figuring out what you actually need to do this project. So even if you do a modular budget, I would recommend that you go through the exercise of figuring out generally what it actually will cost you. And then if you want to put less details and not include specific numbers and make your life maybe easier in the end, maybe do a modular budget. But I still think you need to have a good understanding of what things actually are going to cost you if you want to be feasible. I also found this graph, which I thought was interesting, because I thought, again, this is just one institute, and this is, from 2016 to 20. But according to this, at least from this one institute, they say there's no difference or advantage between non-modular and modular. But to me, it sort of looks like having a non-modular budget maybe could be an advantage, at least by this graph at this institute. Anyway, so moving on, I think everything I'm going to say next really doesn't matter if you're doing a modular or non-modular budget. I think still applies. Again, sorry about my voice. Okay, so the budget justification is one section where you don't have page limits. And so I say use this to your advantage. The thing that I do, no matter what, sorry, I'm seeing what's coming up here. Okay, sorry. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong screen here. Okay, so what I start my budget justification out every single time is a summary of the team. Because if you think about it, there's really no other place in your entire application where you can really include this where it makes sense. And so before I go into my detailed budget and key personnel, just like a paragraph at the beginning, which summarizes, this is my team. I'm going to bullet point or highlight, bold every single team member and point out their role. And then I'm going to just briefly summarize, why they're important to carry out this project. Because again, I think this really is the one place before you tell them about each individual person, you can give them a summary of like why this team is cohesive and why you need each and every part. And you're kind of, I think grants are a test of tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So here's before you get into it, you're telling them what you're going to tell them. To the things I hear the most in terms of criticisms about the budget justification is it's not clear, who's doing what, or I don't understand what role person X is playing. I hear that so many times when I'm in study section. I don't think I've ever been on a study section where I have not heard these exact phrases. So I have a key kind of format that I think if you use this format, you will never run into this issue. Every single person on whether it's a key personnel, a non-key personnel, consultant, a contract research organization, I use this exact format, which is for each person, I put their name, their degree, their role, then their effort, their calendar months, and then if you have a non-modular budget, the exact amount of, the numbers. Then I next summarize just briefly their current position. So, start with this person is a professor at, Georgia Tech, and their key expertise related to the proposed studies. And then, their role, anything highly relevant, his specific role in this application or putting together this pre-application. And then I have this bullet pointed list of key responsibilities. And this is critical to me because I think if you do this, no one will ever ask these two questions, which I so commonly hear. I lay out exactly what each person's doing. I point out exactly which aims, even if it's an alternative approach, like, hey, they're going to do this, they're going to help oversee this, they're going to, even things that aren't in the aims, they're going to contribute to intellectual property development or any role, even if it's a technical person, you may say, they're going to oversee animal studies, X, Y, and Z, and, aim 1, but they're going to contribute to figure preparation. They're going to contribute to, anything that they're doing so that there's absolutely no question about what role each person's playing. And then this is a circumstance where I even use this as an opportunity to address a prior critique. So in this particular case, the prior critique had mentioned, it's not specified if that facility has the necessary equipment for med chem synthesis, purification, blah, blah. And of course, I address this in different areas of the grant. I addressed it in, obviously, the response to reviewers, obviously in the facilities, but it doesn't hurt to just re-point out something so that nobody missed it. I mean, this was a concern last time around, so I want to make sure everybody got it this time. So this is my format, like I said, for no matter who's involved, even down to consultants and non-key personnel. I think it's very helpful to do this. Okay, so the other part is I personally, again, I have a very strict kind of template, and one of the mistakes I recently made, usually I do it, but I didn't do it this past time, is I usually require everyone, like if I have a subcontract, that I ask them, can you please put your stuff in my template, just so that everything looks the same, that it's clear, it's easier to find the information. And as you can see, like my template versus what just happened. And this went okay, and it got through the grant, review process fine. But when it got to the JIT, this is where I got tons of problems from this. There was missing information, and it was really hard for me to see because it's not my budget, it's somebody else's budget. It's a subcontract. But when they don't have it in my template, it's harder for me to really understand, do they have all the right information? Is everything correct? If they have it in my template, it's really clear because I can easily just walk through what I'm used to seeing. But what I actually found was there was missing information, there was inaccurate information, and that led to all kinds of budget adjustments in their subcontract, which then impacted budget adjustments for the total budget. Ended up being just a huge nightmare paperwork wise. So I'm moving forward, I usually require this, but because of this was a foreign subcontract, and I don't know, whatever reason, maybe I was too busy, I didn't do it this one time, and it came back to bite me. So I would recommend just even giving people your template, just like this, like say, here's the template. Can you please fill it out accordingly? And then just review it, make sure it's accurate. That seems to help, especially with consistency and being sure you have all the right information. I think it's important to make sure that whether it's modular, non-modular, that the work coincides with, when they're actually doing the work. So if this person is only doing work in year 2, make sure that, it's reflected here, like this person's role is only in year 2. On the flip side, this on my screen is coming out blurry. I don't know if it's coming out. Another example, and this is something that I've had a ding on in the past, is, like I'll have a technician and I'll say, their role is animal studies. And then the reviewer will say, well, animal studies really are only happening in year 3 and 4. So why do you have this person at 50% effort for year 1 through 4? That makes no sense. So, make it realistic based on what you're actually proposing. Like if this person is only responsible for animal studies, and then you look at your grant and you're like, animal studies really aren't happening until, these years, make sure it accurately reflects that. Otherwise, you will get called out on, why do you have this person on forever? Now, if it's more of a general technician, like they're going to be ordering supplies, and well, this is why you have this, key roles, right? So that they know, like, this person isn't just doing animal studies, they're ordering supplies, they're doing animal care protocols, they're doing other things that require effort, even when the animal studies are not ongoing. So just be clear about what people are doing and when the effort is needed. This is one that I just learned of recently because this turned out to be an issue. They had proposed, I guess for inflation, but NIH came back in the JIT process and said, which is a rule I didn't know until recently, that you can't they don't allow salary escalation. So you can't increase salary due to inflation. You can only change it based on effort. New rule I just learned. Okay, and then lastly, to kind of tie into this is in my BioSketch personal statements, this is something that also I ask and require of anyone that's a key personnel, is that that we do the BioSketch in the same format, at least in terms of the personal statement. So if you see mine, the first part in mine is just a very broad general background. This is the broad umbrella of my background and training and my current research focus. But in everyone that's a key personnel, I ask them to write this section that's called relevant to the current grant application. And then it, reinforces some of the things that you drove, that you started to identify in the justification, like this person is an expertise, has expertise in this, or this person, this is really where you can kind of go to town. And it's really the only place in the application where you can kind of go to town and say, I am the expert here on these things, and this is why I'm playing this role in this application. And, you're calling out your own expertise. I warn not to just simply repeat, reviewers don't like it when you copy paste information that they can read elsewhere. The idea here is that you're, building on what you've, preliminarily told them initially, like this is this person's role and this is their expertise. And now you're giving that person a chance to really break out and explain in detail why they are the expert, why they are needed on this team, why they're unique. You can describe, like, especially things that are become important here, I think, are, I played a role in generating preliminary data on this application, figures X, Y, and Z, and track record of working together, because that's something that also, gets discussed. Like, we have a history of working together. We've developed, 3 patent applications, and we've had 5 grants and 10 publications. Anything that speaks to not only their expertise, but why your track record of working together. So those are my my 2 cents on budget justification. I think, as you can see, I think it all really, again, budget's not a score driving factor, but if you use this space wisely, you can really influence the other things, because if you have this type of information about your team members, their expertise, your track record of working together, there's very specific roles. Those are all things that influence, that play a role or are factored into feasibility, the investigative team and many other things. So it's not, so my only advice here is don't look at this as just this non-score driving, document. Look at it as an opportunity to really provide some unique information that you can't provide in the application elsewhere.
Thank you guys so much. This was just an amazing treasure chest of gold nuggets. We have, just about 5 minutes left, so I'd like to invite the audience to put any questions that you have into the chat. And while you guys are thinking of any, if I could just ask one that came from us as the moderators, which is one thing, again, this audience is mostly ESIs. I'm curious how the panelists think about the benefit of like a multi-PI application in terms of having, people with expertise. That seems like on the one hand, it could help with proving rigor and feasibility. Would you consider that ESI should consider multi-PI applications for their first R01?
Well, I have a strong opinion on that, and I would never advise a new and early stage investigator to put in a multi-PI application with a non-new and early stage investigator, black and white.
Yeah, I agree, because they're kind of giving up their new investigator status. But also, it's really about your team, right? It doesn't, I mean, if this person's leading it, just because they don't have a lot of experience, that's where you fill your team with the right people. If you have the right team, it doesn't matter, if you don't have a lot of, everyone's got to get a start and have their first grant at some point. People understand that.
I agree.
Oh, I'll ask one. Any thoughts on when you're creating that team? One of the things we thought of is how do you decide who's a co-I, who's a collaborator, who's a consultant? Like, what do you think is the best way to kind of go about considering those roles for different team members?
The first thing that comes to mind is where they're located, right? Like if it's a person at your institution, they can't be a consultant by definition, I think. So if it's an external person, that's, and they're providing kind of like expertise, help, they're, looking at your data, but not physically doing work. They're not actually doing work at their institution. That's more of a consultant role. If they're doing work at their, institution, that's different, right? Because that's requires effort and a budget, or so that may be a subcontract, or they may be more of a subcontract. It really depends on each individual case. But I think it just needs to make sense in the grand scheme of things. Like if you have your full, application and you're thinking about your team, it's like, all right, if you were to break it out, like what, like I'm the PI, this person plays a role, like, what type of role, how much effort, just really genuinely think about if the whole thing is like one big pie, how much effort do you give them? And then again, thinking about if they're actually doing work or providing advice. I think that's a key distinguishing feature of like co-I versus consultant.
I agree, and I wanted to add 2 small points. One is just that the vocabulary is very new to young people and confusing, and that's an example of where you should go to your mentor and say, what role should this person be, because they've been through it all and the words are confusing. They're still confusing to me. Point 2 is consultants should be used very sparingly. That is unusual in my career to ever agree to be a consultant or employ a consultant. I favor subcontracts and collaborators. So it is common for young people to be told subcontracts too much is a pain. Don't do, just make the person consultant. Bad advice in general. If there's work, as Dr. Hecker said, if there's work to be done, let the budget reflect that, and that's usually a subcontract with a collaborator or co-op.
I want to agree with Drs. Hecker and Kotton. And I want to say 2 additional things. First, I want to I want to echo what I think Dr. Kotton brought up in his comments, and that is a good research administrator or grants administrator can be an essential component to an effective research team. So make that person part of your team as best as you can and empower them to address the questions that sit between science and the grant support process. And if you have an effective person there, it can make you much more highly successful, and it can make you much more productive. So try to build that type of relationship if you can at all.
We have two questions in the chat. One first from Tanya, which I think is a wonderful question. So I think this gets to the, I guess, proving feasibility within your team. Do you have to have joint publications? What is the degree of a relationship that is required to justify a co-I consultant or collaborator, especially for kind of like an ESI RO, where you might not have co-publications?
I would say joint publications are great, but not necessary. If the joint publications in the area of the proposal are not evident, then some additional comments from your potential co-investigator about their commitment to you as an investigator and to the project can be helpful.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Kotton, were you going to say something?
No, I was going to go on to the other question in the chat.
Yeah. So the next question is, Roger says, I've been told to avoid subcontracts and avoid surpassing the 500,000 threshold for first R01 submission. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I like subcontracts. I think the rule, asking a mentor, experienced person is the key who will give you guidance. I advise. I think there's nothing wrong with subcontracts. 500,000, it depends. If you're running a clinical trial, you may need that and you'll need special permission. But I think the guiding rubric here is don't be a pig. So study sections are filled with human beings, and the psychology is people don't like greedy people who are asking for too much money that they don't need. But if the budget justified, if it's a big clinical trial with a lot of CAT scans involved, you're going to need to ask for a lot of money. So what I mean is the justification should reflect what you need, and you should only ask for what you need, and be careful that you really need it, because you can be a pig if you're asking for $700,000 to do a small mouse project that would raise red flags.
All right. I had one question about an earlier part of our talk. Dr. Mariani had mentioned that one way to look at Rigor and experimental design was characterized by the use of contemporary methods. I'm curious, if you have advice on when early investigators should put more effort or detail into justifying a specific methodology that they're choosing, and whether it's sufficient to simply cite a paper that used that or that they have published with that versus incorporating it into a figure that's actually in the grant.
I'm giving pause for one of my co-presenters to answer that. That's a great, although somewhat complex question. I don't know that one necessarily needs to justify the use of more contemporary or more innovative methods, but I think one needs to appreciate that in the current scoring system, innovation is a scorable category, a scorable criterion. And there's two components to how innovation is scored. One is conceptual and one is methodological, right? So it sort of becomes a mathematical question, right? How to get to 10? Well, you add points here and you add points there. It remains to be seen what the impact of the new streamlined scoring system is going to have on that. That being said, the enthusiasm of a reviewer is correlated to some extent with with how contemporary the approach is. I was going to echo one other thing that some of my co-presenters said. Maybe Dr. Kotton emphasized how approach is, although all the categorical scores are equal, approach is the one most highly correlated with overall impact, right? So it's hard to have the most enthusiasm for an experimental design that is based solely on sort of non-contemporary, some might use the term old-fashioned experimental methods. I know that's not a complete answer to your question, but it's the most candid one I think I can give.
I just wanted to add a personal story to a failure. So when you ask about approach, etc., you need to give yourself time, in response to your question, time to think about how you want to approach things and make it clear, and then reread it and give it to your mentors. So for me, my first grant, I was just spending so long on all that scholarly review and rationale and background and introduction that I left myself no time for the actual approach. So it was dashed off. And the comment actually said, this is a grant written with a stream of consciousness feel to it. So that's an actual quote from a reviewer who was totally right. And it was a terrible, triage grant. And I guess learn from my mistakes and give yourself really time for the important things. Page 1 to your mentor early. And then the approach has to be, it takes time and it's hard and you need to read, reread, and have it edited. Don't spend all your time on the introduction and scholarly review.
All right. Thank you all so much. I think it's a testament that we're past the hour and we still have 29 people registered listening. This was a wealth of information. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. And enjoy the rest of your day.